David sat at the kitchen table, staring at his coffee cup, the warm steam rising in delicate spirals. The house was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Rebecca had left for her weekly shopping, but something felt off. The silence, which once felt peaceful, now felt like a heavy weight pressing on his chest. For years, their life had been what others might call perfect. 2 kids, a house in a good neighborhood, steady jobs. But lately, David had felt like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't quite see. It wasn't just the silence or Rebecca's growing distance. It was the nagging feeling that something had shifted between them, something deep and irreversible. He remembered when they first got together, how they would talk for hours, laughing over simple things. But now, the conversation was thin, as if they were merely going through the motions of living together. Was it just me? David thought, running a hand over his face. Had I stopped trying? Or had she? The last few weeks had been full of little signs. Rebecca's late nights at work, her sudden interest in texting late into the night. Her phone, once a shared connection between them, now seemed like a wall, something she guarded fiercely. Whenever David would ask who she was texting, she'd smile too quickly, her eyes too bright. "Just a friend," she would say. But David knew. He could feel it. There was a wall now, built out of something unspoken. He had tried to ignore it, bury his feelings under the pretense that work stress or life's monotony had taken over, but he knew better. And today, as he sat there feeling the weight of the empty house, his mind kept returning to one thing: her phone. David stood up, his legs stiff, and walked toward the kitchen counter. Her phone lay there, forgotten for a moment, its screen face up. His heart raced. He hadn't meant to look. He promised himself he wouldn't, but the temptation felt unbearable. With trembling hands, he picked it up. For a moment, he stared at the screen. Texts from work, group chats, the usual. But then his eye caught something. "Boss," a text from someone David didn't recognize. His breath caught in his throat. "I'll meet you tonight, boss. Don't be late." David felt a chill wash over him. His mind raced, replaying the words over and over, trying to piece it together. He had seen that word before. Boss, a term Rebecca never used. Never. His hands shook as he clicked open the message. The sender, a number he didn't know, had sent several messages, all accompanied by a series of heart emojis. David's stomach turned. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just a friendly relationship. Rebecca had been lying. Had she been seeing someone? David felt the world tilt. The life he thought he knew, the life they had built together, began to unravel right before his eyes. He grabbed the phone tighter, his fingers burning with anger, his mind screaming with disbelief. But his anger was quickly replaced by a sharp pang of pain in his chest. He felt like he had been punched in the gut, the wind knocked out of him. How long, he wondered. How long had she been hiding this from me? Suddenly, the sound of the door opening pulled him out of his thoughts. Rebecca walked in, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Hey, babe, how was your morning?" She smiled, oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside him. David didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to answer. His eyes kept flicking back to the phone, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight. I need to talk to you," David finally said, his voice rough with the intensity of the moment. Rebecca frowned, a look of concern crossing her face. "What's wrong?" David didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. His mind was swirling, trying to find the words. How could I have missed this? Instead, he placed the phone on the counter between them. Rebecca's face went pale when she saw the screen. She didn't have to say anything. The guilt was written all over her face. "Who's boss?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca's lips parted, but she didn't speak. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of guilt and fear. She knew the jig was up. David could see the way her shoulders sagged, her eyes flickering away from his. "Rebecca," David's voice cracked. "Who is he?" Her silence was the answer he feared. She knew it was over. She knew he knew. The dam broke. David's emotions spilled out all at once: anger, hurt, betrayal, confusion. "How could you do this? After everything we've built, after everything I've done for you?" His voice rose, echoing through the empty house. "How long, Rebecca? How long?" Rebecca's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. David felt a wave of frustration crash over him. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to lash out at her for betraying him in the worst way possible. But instead, he stood there, feeling like the ground beneath him had shifted. He felt small, useless, helpless. Finally, Rebecca broke the silence. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to get this far, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know how to stop. David shook his head, the weight of her words landing like a slap to the face. She didn't know how to stop. He didn't know how to respond. I can't believe you did this, he whispered, backing away slowly. The silence in the house had grown thicker since the confrontation. David couldn't look at Rebecca the same way anymore. The anger simmered beneath his skin, but it wasn't just anger. It was something far worse. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and hollowed out, like someone had ripped the core of his life away from him, leaving only fragments of what once was. It had been a week since David found the text from James, the one with the word boss on it. Rebecca had said nothing more about it, and every time he tried to bring it up, she shut down. It was as though the conversation itself was too much for her to handle. The coldness between them only grew. Rebecca wasn't just distant now. She was completely closed off, and David felt like a stranger in his own home. David had to know more. He wasn't satisfied with the half-hearted apology she had offered the night he found out about the affair. He could see it in her eyes, the lies she wasn't willing to admit. She had a secret, and it was eating away at him. He wasn't sure what he wanted, closure, answers, or perhaps even the truth. But something inside him needed to know. His suspicions were driving him mad, and every moment he spent not confronting Rebecca, he felt like he was suffocating. He couldn't just live with this unknown, not when his mind was unraveling every minute. The pain had become a constant presence, gnawing at him. Every word she spoke now sounded like a lie. Every time she kissed him or smiled, it felt as if she was hiding something just beneath the surface. The woman he had loved for so long was becoming a stranger to him. One evening, when Rebecca was out on one of her errands, David seized the opportunity. His hands shook as he picked up her phone from the kitchen counter, the same one that had betrayed him just days ago. This time there would be no hesitation. This time he would find the truth. He unlocked the phone with her simple passcode and immediately went to the messages. His heart raced. Scrolling through the messages with James felt like a violation, yet he couldn't stop himself. The texts were intimate, filled with flirtation, secret plans, and words he never thought he would see coming from Rebecca. The latest message was a chilling one. I can't wait to see you tonight. We need to talk about what happens next. David's stomach twisted. What were they planning? What could she possibly mean by that? There was no mention of David in any of it. The message felt cold, detached, and it hit him like a punch to the gut. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process it all. He needed to calm down. He had to think clearly. His mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, each one worse than the last. Could she be planning to leave him? Was this affair more serious than he'd imagined? And what about James? Was he the one pulling the strings, or was Rebecca just as guilty of playing this dangerous game? David felt a mix of fear and anger. He wanted to confront her, demand the truth right there. But he knew deep down that doing so would only push her further away. He needed to be strategic. He needed evidence, something undeniable. As the hours dragged on, David tried to gather his thoughts. He kept coming back to one thing: Rebecca's behavior. It wasn't just the affair, it was the coldness, the distance. She had no remorse, no guilt. How could she be so careless with their lives? How could she betray him so completely and still go on as if nothing had changed? The door creaked open, pulling David from his spiraling thoughts. Rebecca was home. Her eyes flickered to him as she entered, a fleeting glance. "You okay?" she asked, her voice too calm, too practiced. David looked at her. He could feel the anger bubbling up, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Where were you?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Rebecca paused. "Just out," she said, shrugging as though it was nothing. David couldn't help the smirk that twisted his lips. Just out. What a lie. The world was breaking apart around him, and all she could offer were these half-truths. "You know," he said slowly, leaning against the kitchen counter, "I can't stop thinking about what you've been doing." Rebecca froze. For a moment, David could see the tiniest flicker of fear in her eyes, but it was gone before she could stop it. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight, pretending to be nonchalant. "What's going on with you and James?" David demanded, the words bursting out of him before he could control them. "You think I didn't notice? Think I'm blind?" Rebecca's face paled, but she didn't move. Her lips parted, but no words came out. David stepped closer, his voice growing low and threatening. "What's really going on, Rebecca? Tell me." The tension in the room crackled like static, and Rebecca's breath hitched as she finally met his gaze. For a moment, neither of them said anything. It was as though they were locked in a silent battle, each waiting for the other to break. Finally, Rebecca spoke, her voice almost too quiet to hear. "David, please, you don't understand." David's heart pounded. "I understand more than you think," he whispered harshly. "And I won't just sit here while you destroy everything we've built. You owe me the truth. All of it." She closed her eyes, and David could see the tears forming, but they didn't come. She was on the verge of breaking, but she was still holding back. I can't tell you everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. David stepped back, the weight of her words crashing down on him. He didn't know what he expected to hear, but this was worse. The silence between them was deafening. The trust they'd built had shattered into a million pieces, and all that remained was the cold, painful truth that neither of them could escape. The days that followed the confrontation felt like an unrelenting storm. David could feel the tension thickening in the house with each passing hour, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Rebecca's silence was suffocating, and it gnawed at him constantly. She had retreated even further into herself, her eyes avoiding his at every turn, and her presence felt more like an echo than a person. Every word she spoke seemed rehearsed, too calm, too controlled. But beneath that calm was something more dangerous, something he couldn't quite grasp. He couldn't shake the thought of James. His name kept echoing in David's mind like a constant hum, a reminder of everything that had been taken from him. Who was he? What had he done to Rebecca? And what did he mean to her? David had spent days wrestling with these questions, but every answer seemed more painful than the last. The affair wasn't just an affair, it was a declaration of war. Rebecca had chosen James, and David couldn't ignore the fact that she had willingly built a life with him, a life that didn't include David. The betrayal stung in a way that felt both fresh and like an old wound, reopening every time he looked at her. Each moment they spent in the same house now felt like a battlefield. She avoided him, and he refused to speak unless absolutely necessary. The silence between them was deafening. It had been days since that awful night, and there had been no apology, no remorse from her. There was just a deep, uncomfortable void between them, one that neither of them seemed able or willing to fill. David tried to keep his mind occupied, focusing on work, on the kids. But even that felt hollow. His thoughts were consumed by Rebecca's betrayal. He couldn't escape the image of her with James, the warmth in her eyes when she looked at him, the secret smiles she had hidden so well from David. How long had this been going on? What other lies had she told me? But the more he thought about it, the more his mind began to spiral. The rage he felt was suffocating. His chest tightened whenever he thought about what she had done, about how she had lied and deceived him for so long. And the worst part? He didn't even know what to do with all the anger. It churned in his stomach, boiling over whenever he tried to push it down. One evening, as David walked into the living room, he saw Rebecca sitting on the couch, her face blank as she scrolled through her phone. It had become routine, her retreat into her phone whenever they were in the same space. It was as if the device acted as a barrier between them, a way for her to remain in her world while he festered in his own. "Rebecca." David's voice broke through the quiet. She didn't even look up. She just kept scrolling, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Rebecca," he said again, louder this time, his voice thick with emotion. "We need to talk." Her fingers stopped moving, but she didn't lift her gaze. It felt like she was purposefully avoiding him, as though acknowledging him would shatter the fragile illusion she had built. Finally, she sighed and put the phone down beside her. "I don't know what you want me to say," she said, her voice flat, almost lifeless. David's heart clenched. What did he want her to say? What could she possibly say to make this better? How could she explain herself when the truth was staring them both in the face? He wasn't sure anymore if he wanted answers. He wasn't even sure he could trust the words that would come from her mouth. All he knew was that he couldn't keep living like this. "Tell me why," he asked, his voice cracking. "Why did you do this to me? To us?" Rebecca's eyes flicked up to his, and for the first time in days their gazes met. But there was no softness in her eyes, no guilt, no remorse, just a hollow emptiness that crushed him. "I don't know," she whispered. I needed something. I was lonely, David. You were always so distant, so wrapped up in everything else. I didn't feel like I mattered anymore." David's breath caught in his throat. Lonely? He had tried. He had been there for her, hadn't he? He'd supported her, loved her, done everything he could to build a life together, and she had felt lonely? "Is that really your excuse?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "You couldn't come to me? You couldn't talk to me?" Rebecca didn't respond. She just looked away, her eyes dropping to her lap as though the weight of his words was too much for her to bear. But David felt it too, the pain, the suffocating weight of it all. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice shaking. "You betrayed everything we built. How do we fix this?" Rebecca's silence was her answer. David couldn't bear it anymore. He turned away, his fists clenched at his sides, the burning anger threatening to spill over. "I can't live like this anymore, Rebecca," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay." She didn't respond, but David didn't need her to. The distance between them had already become too wide, and he knew deep down that no matter what she said, things could never go back to the way they were. He left the room without another word, his heart heavy with a pain he couldn't name, and the silence once again filled the house. Only this time it wasn't just the quiet of a family living together. It was the silence of a marriage unraveling, piece by painful piece. David woke up the next morning with a sinking feeling in his chest, as though the weight of the truth had become a permanent part of him. The night had been restless. The anger, the heartbreak, he couldn't escape them. They were like shadows, following him into his waking hours, clouding every thought, every action. He glanced at Rebecca, who was lying next to him, her back turned toward him. She hadn't spoken much since their confrontation. She had said a few words of apology, words that felt hollow, forced. There was no emotion in her voice, no real acknowledgement of the destruction she had caused. He wondered, not for the first time, if she even cared about the wreckage she had left behind. David rolled out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake her. He wasn't sure why he still cared about keeping things peaceful between them. Maybe it was because he wasn't ready to face the reality of what had happened yet. Or maybe, just maybe, he was still hoping that somewhere deep inside, the woman he married hadn't completely disappeared. But hope, David realized, was a dangerous thing. It was the reason he had stayed in the dark for so long, the reason he hadn't confronted her sooner. The same hope that made him believe, against all evidence, that they could get through this, that she might change, that they could somehow rebuild. His fingers trembled as he poured himself a cup of coffee, his mind racing through the events of the past few days, the messages, the lies, the coldness. Rebecca's face when he had confronted her about the affair. She had looked guilty for a moment, but the guilt didn't last. It was replaced by defensiveness, by a refusal to truly apologize. The emptiness between them felt like a chasm, widening with each passing second. Just then, Rebecca stirred in bed, her eyes fluttering open. David froze, watching her, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement, some sign that she was feeling the same ache, but she only blinked, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Morning," she said, her voice flat. David's jaw tightened. Morning? Was that all she could say? He tried to push the bitterness down. It wasn't helping. Nothing was helping. "Rebecca," he said, his voice tight, We need to talk." She sighed, clearly frustrated, and sat up, the sheets rustling around her. She didn't look at him right away, and the silence stretched on for far too long. "About what?" she finally asked, her tone barely more than a whisper. "About us," he replied. He could hear the edge in his voice, the desperation that had been building up for days. "About everything, about what you've done." Rebecca winced as if his words had physically hit her, but there was no remorse in her eyes. There was only exhaustion, maybe even fear. But it wasn't the kind of fear that came from knowing she had destroyed someone's life. It was the fear of being confronted, of having to face the consequences of her actions. "I don't want to talk about this right now, David," she muttered, her voice growing sharper, her guard going up. "We've already talked about it." "No," David said, his voice low and firm. "We haven't. Not really." His chest tightened as he spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. "I need to understand, Rebecca. How could you do this to me, to us?" Her face hardened at his question. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked away, avoiding his gaze. The silence hung heavily between them, a thick wall neither of them could tear down. "I don't know," she finally said, the words coming out in a rush, almost as if she couldn't stop them. I was so lonely, David. You were always so distant, always busy with work, with everything except me. I needed someone. I needed someone to make me feel wanted." David's heart dropped, lonely. Was that really her excuse? He wanted to scream, to rage at her, to ask how she could so easily betray everything they had. But instead, he just sat there, numb, staring at her. "Rebecca, we had everything," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We had a life, a family, a future." Her eyes flickered with something like regret. But it was fleeting. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she said, her voice softer now, almost fragile. "I never meant to hurt you. But I couldn't just keep pretending that everything was fine." David stared at her, disbelief taking root deep inside him. "Pretending?" he repeated. "That's what this was to you? A game? A lie?" "No, that's not what I meant," she said quickly, her voice desperate, almost pleading. "I was trying to survive, David. I couldn't survive like this anymore." David stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "So you thought the answer was to cheat? To destroy everything we built?" His breath hitched as he spun to face her. "How could you even look me in the eyes after everything we've been through?" I don't know," Rebecca stammered. She was trembling now, but it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. "I never meant for it to go this far." "Too late," David muttered bitterly. His chest felt tight, his heart aching. "Too late for all of it." Rebecca stared at him, her face crumpling as if she was about to break. But David couldn't bring himself to care. He had given her everything. He had loved her, trusted her, and now all of it was gone. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was suffocating, a constant reminder of everything that had been lost. Finally, David spoke again, his voice cold. "I'm done," he said. "I can't do this anymore. I can't live like this." Rebecca's eyes widened in shock, and for the first time something resembling guilt flashed across her face. But it was too little, too late. David turned and walked out of the room, leaving Rebecca behind, the sound of her sobs following him like a distant echo. The silence between David and Rebecca had become unbearable. It had been days since they last spoke, the chasm between them growing wider with each passing moment. The pain in David's chest felt constant, a weight that he couldn't shake off. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was replaced by something deeper, something he hadn't anticipated, a sense of defeat. Rebecca had remained distant, and David had done nothing but brood in the shadow of their shattered marriage. He had tried to reach out, tried to find some flicker of hope in the woman he had loved for so long. But every time he looked at her, all he could see was the cold betrayal. He couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't pretend that things would get better. The house had become a prison to him. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was everything that had led up to it. The empty promises, the lies, the deceit. It all weighed heavily on his soul. Tonight, the tension in the house had reached a boiling point. David had stayed out of the way, trying to avoid her as much as possible. But as he sat in the living room staring at the flickering TV, the suffocating silence seemed louder than ever. He could hear the soft sound of footsteps behind him, Rebecca's presence an unwelcome intrusion. He didn't turn around. He didn't want to see her face. "I'm sorry, David." Her voice broke through the silence, softer than it had been in days. "I know I've hurt you, but—" David's heart skipped a beat. He didn't want to hear it anymore. He didn't want to listen to her empty apologies. "Sorry," he whispered, barely recognizing his own voice. "Sorry doesn't change anything." Rebecca paused, her breath trembling. He could feel her standing behind him, the guilt in her posture almost palpable. But David wasn't ready to forgive. He wasn't ready to forget. The damage had been done, and no amount of words could undo it. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice suddenly steady and firm. "I can't keep living like this." The room grew colder. The air thickened, as though the very walls were closing in on him. David had made up his mind. There was no more pretending, no more hoping that things would somehow fix themselves. It was over. Rebecca's silence weighed heavily on him, her presence now just a reminder of the life they had once shared. She moved slowly toward him, her footsteps tentative, as if she were afraid to approach him any closer. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked, her voice small and filled with fear. David turned to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. She was standing there, tears threatening to spill from her eyes, but David didn't feel any compassion for her. Not anymore. "I'm done, Rebecca," he said softly, his gaze hard. "I can't be with someone who can't be honest with me. I won't live in this lie anymore." Her face crumpled, but David didn't flinch. He had been betrayed in the worst way possible, and his heart had no more room for her excuses. The woman he had loved had disappeared long ago, replaced by a stranger, a liar. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to lose you." "Then why didn't you tell me the truth?" David's voice cracked, the pain threatening to swallow him whole. "Why didn't you come to me? Why did you have to go behind my back?" Rebecca took a step forward, but David held his ground. He didn't want her near him anymore, not like this. "I was afraid," she said, her eyes filled with tears now. "Afraid of what would happen if I told you. Afraid of losing you." David laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the quiet room. "You already lost me, Rebecca. You lost me the moment you decided to betray me." The finality in his words hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Rebecca closed her eyes, her body trembling as if the weight of it all was crashing down on her. And for a moment, David almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But he knew better now. There was no more room for sympathy, not for someone who had torn their life apart without a second thought. "I'm leaving," he said quietly, standing up and moving toward the door. He couldn't stay here another minute. He couldn't be in this house, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. Rebecca didn't stop him. She didn't even speak. The tears streamed down her face as she stood motionless, watching him walk away. She knew deep down that it was too late. David stepped outside, the cool night air hitting his face like a slap. It felt like a moment of clarity, like he had finally broken free from the prison he had locked himself in. He could breathe again for the first time in what felt like forever. But even as he walked away from the house, the weight of everything still clung to him. The pain of betrayal, the heartbreak. It would linger for a long time. But he was done. Done with the lies. Done with the pain. He wasn't sure what came next. He didn't know how he would move forward. But he knew one thing for sure. It was time for a new chapter. A chapter without her. The shock of David's sudden departure lingered in the air. Rebecca sat motionless on the couch, staring at the door that David had walked through, as though waiting for him to come back and fix everything. But she knew better. It was too late for apologies, too late for promises. What was left now was the aftermath of the choices she had made. The house, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a cage. Her heart was pounding in her chest, each breath heavy and labored, suffocating under the weight of the lies she had built. She wanted to scream, to let the world know what had happened, but the silence was deafening. Every corner of the house reminded her of the broken pieces, the fragments of a life she had shattered. The doorbell rang suddenly, sharp and jarring. It was too early for anyone to be visiting. With trepidation, Rebecca stood up and walked toward the door, her steps slow and heavy. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," the officer said, his voice professional but cold. "I'm Detective Hayes. We need to ask you a few questions about your husband's recent death." Rebecca's stomach dropped. The calmness in her voice barely masked the shock she felt. "David?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. What happened?" The detective's eyes narrowed, and Rebecca noticed how his gaze flicked toward her nervously. "We've got reason to believe that your husband's death wasn't from natural causes," he said, his tone now more intense. "We're treating it as a potential homicide." Rebecca's heart raced. Her hands went clammy, and for a moment everything around her felt as though it was spinning out of control. Homicide? David was dead, and now they were investigating him? The shock was almost too much to bear. I don't understand," she stammered, unable to keep the tremor out of her voice. "David, he was fine. He just left this morning." Detective Hayes stepped inside without waiting for her invitation, his eyes scanning the room methodically. He wasn't here to comfort her, and he wasn't here for small talk. He was here for one thing, the truth. "We're going to need you to come down to the station for further questioning," the detective said, his eyes fixed on her, "and we'll need your cooperation." Rebecca stood frozen for a moment, unable to process the rapid turn of events. Her mind raced. How had they discovered? What was happening? She had poisoned David, yes, but she had been so careful. She had done everything to cover her tracks, to make it look like a tragic accident. And yet here she was, standing on the verge of losing everything. She nodded wordlessly, too scared to argue, and allowed the detective to lead her to the car. As they drove to the station, her mind continued to spin. Her thoughts a whirlwind of panic and guilt. How had it come to this? She hadn't expected this, hadn't imagined the police would be involved. But now everything was out of control, and there was no way out. The questioning room was sterile and unfeeling, the walls too white, the air too still. Rebecca sat on the hard chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She kept her eyes on the floor, avoiding the piercing gaze of Detective Hayes. She knew what was coming, there was no avoiding it. The truth was unraveling, and soon she would have to face the consequences. Detective Hayes sat across from her, his eyes studying her, trying to gauge her every movement. "We've spoken with the coroner, Mrs. Thompson," he began. "David was poisoned. We know it was slow-acting, and we've found traces of the substance in his system. It's a type of poison that, when administered correctly, mimics the symptoms of natural death. But it's not natural, and it's not an accident." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The detective knew. He knew she had done it. There was no denying it now. She couldn't speak. The words were stuck in her throat, choking her, suffocating her. She couldn't even look at him. "You don't have to answer right away," the detective continued, his tone softer now but still firm. "We can take our time. But I need to know, did you do it? Did you kill him?" Rebecca's heart thundered in her chest, her hands shaking violently. She wanted to deny it, to lie and pretend that it had all been some horrible mistake, but she couldn't. The guilt weighed so heavily on her that it was impossible to bear. Her mind flashed back to that night, the night she had poisoned David's drink. She had thought it would be easy. She had thought that once he was gone, everything would fall into place. She could be with James, start over, live the life she had always dreamed of. But now she was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. "I did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I poisoned him. I didn't know what else to do. I was desperate." The words fell from her lips like a confession, a burden she had carried too long. There was no turning back now. Detective Hayes leaned forward, his eyes hardening. "Why, Rebecca? Why did you do it?" Rebecca closed her eyes, the weight of his question pressing down on her. She had no good answer. There was no justification for what she had done. She had been selfish, consumed by her own desires, her own need for escape, and in the process, she had destroyed everything. "I thought I could get away with it," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought it would be easy, but now it's all falling apart." The detective sat back, his expression unreadable. "You're facing serious charges, Rebecca. You've taken a life and now you'll have to answer for it." Rebecca nodded, her tears falling freely now. There was no redemption, no coming back from this. She had made her choice and now she would pay the price. The interrogation room was cold, sterile. The walls felt as though they were closing in on Rebecca. She sat there, hands clenched tightly in her lap, her mind still spinning from everything that had happened. The detective had left the room moments ago, giving her space. But she hadn't moved an inch. The weight of the confession hung over her like a dark cloud. She had done it. She had killed David, the man she had once loved, the father of her children, the man who had trusted her. She had taken his life in an attempt to escape her own. And now she was sitting in a room, facing the reality of what she had done. Her thoughts were a mess, tangled in guilt and regret. She had poisoned him. She had taken everything from him. And for what? A fleeting affair with James, a man who had used her for his own gain. What had she really gained from this? Nothing. Only this hollow emptiness inside her chest. She had thought that once David was gone, everything would fall into place. But it hadn't. It had only left her drowning in her own mistakes. Her mind flashed back to that night, the night she had prepared the drink for him. She had slipped the poison in with practiced ease, thinking it would be simple, thinking it would be the key to her freedom. But now, as she sat in that cold, lifeless room, she realized that it was the worst mistake of her life. The door opened, and Detective Hayes stepped back into the room, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone reminded her of the gravity of the situation. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to say anymore. There were no more excuses, no more lies to tell. All she had left was the truth. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Hayes began, his voice low and steady. "You've confessed to poisoning your husband. We've gathered all the evidence we need. The autopsy report, the poison, the messages between you and James, everything points to you." Rebecca closed her eyes, the words sinking deep into her soul. She hadn't even realized how much she had been hoping for some kind of mercy. But there was none. There was no mercy in what she had done. There was only the undeniable fact of her guilt. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know what I've done. I don't need you to tell me. I'm not asking for mercy. I deserve whatever happens." Detective Hayes studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Why, Rebecca? Why did you do it?" The question was one that had been haunting her for days. She had asked herself the same thing over and over again, but she couldn't come up with an answer that made sense. There was no excuse for what she had done. There was no justification that could explain the depth of her betrayal. "I was scared," Rebecca said, her voice trembling. "I was so scared. I didn't know what to do. David, he wasn't there for me anymore. He was distant. He didn't see me. He didn't love me the way I needed him to. I thought if I left him, if I started fresh with James, everything would be okay. But it wasn't. I thought if I killed him, if I made him go away, I could have everything I wanted. But now I see that I destroyed everything. I destroyed my family. I destroyed myself." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she wiped them away angrily, frustrated by her own weakness. "You think that's an excuse?" Hayes asked, his voice sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "You think you can just take someone's life because you're unhappy?" "No," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. I know it's unforgivable. I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could fix things by getting rid of the problem, but now I've only created 100 new ones." For the first time since she'd walked into the room, Detective Hayes softened. He didn't pity her, but there was something almost human in his gaze. "You're right. You've created a lot of problems, and now you're going to have to face them." The finality of his words hit Rebecca like a ton of bricks. She had already faced the consequences of her actions in her own way. She had been living with the guilt every second of every day since that night. But hearing those words from him made everything feel more real, more final. She could feel the walls of the interrogation room closing in around her, suffocating her, and for the first time, she truly felt the weight of what she had done. She had taken a life, and now she would have to pay for it. Detective Hayes stood up and walked toward the door. "You'll be arraigned tomorrow. You'll have your day in court and you'll have to answer for what you've done. But you've already confessed. That part is over. Now we just have to make sure you face the consequences." Rebecca nodded numbly. She didn't have the strength to argue. She didn't have the strength for anything anymore. As the detective left the room, Rebecca was left alone with her thoughts, alone with the devastating truth of what she had done, the truth that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had killed David, the man who had once been everything to her, and now there was no going back. The days that followed Rebecca's arrest were a blur of police interviews, courtroom hearings, and the sharp, unrelenting reality of what she had done. As the evidence mounted, the weight of her actions pressed down on her, suffocating her in a way she couldn't escape. She had killed David. She had poisoned him, and now she was paying the price for it. Rebecca sat in her prison cell, her hands trembling as she gripped the metal bars. The walls around her felt like they were closing in, every inch of her being consumed by guilt. She had thought that once David was gone, everything would fall into place. She had imagined a fresh start with James, a new life without the weight of her marriage hanging over her. But now, in the cold, lifeless space of her cell, she realized how wrong she had been. There was no escaping the consequences of her actions, no running from the fact that she had destroyed everything, her family, her love, her future. The trial was a blur. She barely remembered the proceedings, the cold eyes of the judge, the piercing gaze of the prosecutor. What mattered now was the sentence, life in prison, no parole. It was the only justice that could be served for what she had done. But what about her children? The thought of them haunted her day and night. They would grow up without their father, without the stability he had brought to their lives. They would grow up knowing that their mother had killed their father. Could they ever forgive her? Could they ever see her as anything other than the woman who had shattered their world? Rebecca's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching her cell. She turned to see a prison guard standing in the doorway, a folder in his hand. "Visitor," the guard said, his voice indifferent. "You have a visitor." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? She wasn't expecting anyone. James? It couldn't be him. He had distanced himself the moment she was arrested. No, this had to be someone else. Maybe her family, though she had barely spoken to them since the trial. She followed the guard down the cold, sterile hallways, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As they approached the visiting room, Rebecca's stomach twisted with anxiety. Who would come to see her in this place? What could they possibly have to say to her now? The door to the visitation room opened, and Rebecca was ushered in. Her eyes immediately sought out the figure sitting at the table waiting for her. It was David's sister, Sarah. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. Sarah hadn't come to the trial, hadn't come to visit her. But here she was, sitting across from her, her expression hard but not without some trace of sorrow. Sarah's voice was quiet but sharp. "I didn't know if I could do this," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know if I could look at you, but the truth is, Rebecca, I need answers. My brother is gone. He's never coming back, and I need to understand why." Rebecca couldn't look at her. She couldn't face the woman who had once been so kind to her, who had treated her like family. How could she? How could she explain the depths of her selfishness, the betrayal she had caused, to someone who had loved David so completely? I don't have any answers," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. "There's no reason that would make sense. I was lost. I thought it was the only way out." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. "The only way out? For you, maybe. What about David? What about his life? Did you ever think about the consequences for him? For your children?" The words hit Rebecca like a slap, and she flinched, her hands trembling in her lap. "I didn't think," she whispered. I couldn't see a way out. I was so selfish. And now look where I am." Sarah stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You're right. You're here. And you've taken everything from everyone who loved him. You've taken away a father, a son, a husband. And now you'll sit in this cell and think about the choices you made. And you'll live with the consequences." Rebecca's vision blurred as tears began to fall. She didn't wipe them away, couldn't find the strength to stop the flood of emotion. This wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about acknowledging the depth of her mistake, the truth that she had to live with for the rest of her life. "I never meant for it to go this far," she sobbed. "I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to fix what was broken." Sarah turned and walked toward the door. Before she left, she glanced over her shoulder, her face hard. "There's nothing left to fix, Rebecca. You've broken it all, and now you'll have to live with it." With those words, Sarah left, and Rebecca was alone again, alone with her guilt, her regret, and the reality of what she had done. In the silence of the prison, she finally understood the weight of her actions. She had broken everything she had ever loved. She had taken a life, and now she would have to live with the consequences. There was no coming back from this. There was no redemption, just the cold, hard truth of what she had done. What do you think of Rebecca's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On a scale from 0 to 10, what's your score for this shocking story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And if you're looking for more heart-wrenching tales, click here on the end screen to explore more.